live on Facebook. It's thinking. This is always the part where I'm like, I'm never sure when it's exactly live. It's always super fun. All right. Make sure that we're ready to go. All right, and now we're live. So welcome from Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary. My name is Sarah Stonecipher, and I'm the Manager of Operations and Digital Missioner for Lifelong Learning. And I am joined by my colleague, and I will let him introduce himself, and then our esteemed presenter.
Hello, my name is Joymel Gonzalez. I'm a student in VTS and an assistant supporting the work in Lifelong Learning department in VTS. And I am really glad to have with us in this webinar Father Sam de Sordilete. He's the senior priest in St. Stephen's and the Incarnation in Washington, D.C. He has a doctorate degree in liturgy and Latino ministries, and he will be sharing with us much of his, he has been researching and doing in church about the days of the dead.
Mm. Awesome.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to share what I know about the Day of the Dead and some of the traditions we bring. So aside of all the research, there is the piece of growing up in a place where you used to celebrate the Day of the Dead. And I think coming to the United States and working with Latinos from different countries, I have enriched my experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those differences when we get to that point. But yes, I grew up in South Brazil, celebrating the Day of the Dead with similarities and differences that we see nowadays. So I'm going to be sharing things I lived through and things I learned from books and things I learned from people who really live the Day of the Dead. So why don't we let me share with you what I have here. What I've been doing in this past years is offering half-day workshop for the Day of the Dead. Let's see. Did it open?
It did, yeah.
Good.
Go ahead and maximize it so that way it's full screen. There you go, perfect.
Is that still tiny?
That looks pretty good.
Is it going? Okay. What I'm going to do this afternoon is, since we have about 25 minutes to share experiences, is to point out some of the key pieces that I generally work with people who are interested in the Day of the Dead or the Days of the Dead, celebrating the Days of the Dead. And what I have here are, there you go. So I think some of the questions that people ask me is, why it matters to celebrate here in the United States the Day of the Dead? Is this a Mexican devotion only, or do you see that in other countries? Then I would like to talk about the experience of mourning, honoring, and remembering, and going from the personal context to the social dimension. And finally, just give a touch on the symbolism of ofrendas and all the symbols or elements that are present in ofrendas. Ofrendas are the altars that we dedicate to the dead. So we're going to see a little bit more of that on the process. So why it matters to do it in the United States? I came to the United States like 10 years ago, and I have seen the Episcopal Church getting more and more excited with the idea of celebrating and bring cultures together. So initially, I would say it reminds us that we are the people of a resurrection. So we're followers of the risen Christ. The celebration of the Day of the Dead doesn't conflict with the theology of resurrection. Actually, some branches of the church says those are the other holidays that we celebrate the triumph or the victory of life over death. It's just we receive this from indigenous traditions, and we know a little bit of the history when some indigenous understanding of life and death met the understanding or theology of the resurrection in Christ, and how that mix of understanding is renewed in the early colonization of Americas. So it's an encounter of two cultures and different religions and religiosities, and doesn't conflict with the theology of a resurrection. The second piece that I care a lot, it creates a safety space for the Latino community and their descendants to remember their beloved ones. And this is a very interesting piece for me. As Episcopalians, we really want to keep the symbolism of the Day of the Dead very based in what we received from especially Central American countries. So we need to be very careful to understand how it's done. And Mexico, for example, you don't see happening in churches. It happens in three levels. It happens in home, where people build their own personal altars. It comes naturally because some of us already do this. Some of us have, like I said here behind me, there is a little altar. Generally in our homes, we have our own shrine where generally there is a candle, I grew up in a house where there is always a rosary, there is always a Bible, and there is always the image of Our Lady. And in my home, there is an image of Christ. There is a old Easter candle that I got from church. There is a picture of relatives, my grandmother's family. So the tradition of celebrating in home the Day of the Dead, it's something natural. And it's said that before Christians came to the Americas, the indigenous were celebrating for 1 month. And after the invasion of the colonizers, those who brought Christianity kind of forced the indigenous to reduce from 30 days to 2 days. So it was an adjustment of calendar, so they could justify the feasts inside of a Christian calendar. So they adjusted to what we call the All Saints Day, which is November 1st, and All Souls Day, which is November 2nd. Meaning all saints who passed away already, and All Souls, everyone. And indigenous tradition was 30 days. We reduced to 2. So the first level that happens in home bring all the elements that we're gonna see in the end, which have food and art and photos. The second place where the Day of the Dead is celebrated is in the cemetery. So depending on the country, and that's the culture I grew up with. So depending on the country, people on November 1st prepare the altars in home. So there is the expectation of the souls of the children will come in midnight on November 1st. So the altars or the ofrendas needs to be ready on the day before, which is October 31st. So when the souls return at midnight, the altars, the ofrendas are ready. But then November the 2nd, when we celebrate everybody, what do we do? So our tradition is to go to the cemetery. Generally, we go to cemetery to clean up the graves, and we paint the graves. Some countries, the colors are very various. It's always colorful. I grew up in a tradition that we paint everything white as a symbol of a resurrection. And then after it's done, people come and bring flowers of all colors. So there is this white background in an explosion of colors. And I was gonna bring some photos today. I didn't have the chance to select from my hometown. In the third level, the celebration, oh yes, and then in the cemetery, people generally goes in the morning. In my family case, we would bring food for us to eat during the day while we are working there. And we go home when the sunset comes. In Central American countries, the ones I know, parts of Mexico, parts of Central American countries, they stay at the night. And there is food for the living and for the dead. There is music, there are drinks. It depends much of the context. So and finally, the third level where the Days of the Dead happens are on the streets. So I have seen mostly in Mexico the parades where people dressed as a calavera, so skulls, or there's some traditional characters like the Caterina, and people dress like that and go to dance. So all this has to do with celebrating life. Then why the other reason I have here, the number 3, it enriches the body of the church with a renewed understanding of ancient celebration. So we just talked about that. We just provide to the Episcopal Church, who many times in the United States have some ways of doing the celebration, while bringing the Latino tradition into this and finding different ways of celebrating the same understanding. It's just much more refreshing from my point of view. Which leads us to the 4th point. It creates a space to listen one another, because then you create space for sharing stories of life and death. I have been offering workshops about, we have much more time to sit and share stories. Generally, when I begin a workshop, I begin saying, you are here today not to make art. You're here today to remember somebody. So before we do anything else, I will invite you to stop and think, to whom are you dedicating this time? To whom are you creating an ofrenda? To whom are you preparing food? So during the workshop, what people do is bonding. They share, they generally bring their photos. They sit next to somebody and they share the stories of who is this person I'm bringing, why I'm bringing. There is a lot opportunities to talk and bond. The number 5, it's one of my favorites as well. It empowers non-ordained people. You don't need a priest, or don't need a bishop to celebrate the Days of the Dead. Naturally happens in home. And in the United States, because many Latinos can't go to a cemetery, what we do is to create a safe space in the church to those who doesn't have a cemetery to go, to come and celebrate. And then we celebrate as community. What we've been doing is building the ofrendas, bringing food, celebrating Eucharistic liturgy, and sharing food, and dancing and having face painted. And aside of the Eucharistic liturgy, everything else can be done by a non-ordained person. It's a very profound experience, and it's so much joy. The item number 6, it creates a holy mass in church because it forces people to talk about what a sacred space looks like. When I started doing this, I recall the first church we did was always on a side chapel. It was like, it's a little sacred space. It's not a huge sacred space. And the second year we questioned that. It's like, well, it's the celebration of the most important gift of all, resurrection. Is that why we are Christians? So in the second year, we moved the side chapel with the ofrendas, and we made the main sanctuary of the church an entire ofrenda. And since then, I've been inviting people to think about this. Remind us that we're not 100% in control of everything, because the sanctuary, the altar table, and all that space that's the main altar, it becomes a space for everybody. Everybody who is bringing flowers, everybody who is bringing food, everybody who is bringing arts or objects to remember the deceased. And when the ofrendas are set, there is a mix of beauty, but for those who have a traditional understanding of church shape, they may think it's a mess. So I like to say it's a holy mass. And one of the last points I bring is why it matters. It's because we finally create a space. We are back to creative mode to experience holiness through our bodies and hearts. You probably have heard this about Christmas. That is all about buying gifts and pleasing people with gifts you just bought. For the Day of the Dead, most everything we create using our hands and our creativity. So people are going to cook, and they're generally going to cook the food that the deceased love the most. People are going to create flowers, or going to create milagros, going to bring paintings, bring photos. Lately, we've been using sugar skulls. Some of these elements, you need to look the context of your parish. Not everybody feel comfortable with all those elements, so it depends. But it's an opportunity to come together, to learn about the celebration, and work together, using our hands and using our creativity. And I always love doing that, because in the end of the day, things that I have seen people saying I'm not artistic or creative, and they put a lot of love and work on the work they do, and it just ends so well done. Is it a Mexican devotion? So I have been saying through this past minutes that other countries have been celebrating. So even in Mexico, some parts of Mexico celebrate differently. Like Oaxaca has a very specific way of celebrating. Michoacan has a very specific way of celebrating. Interestingly enough, some areas doesn't celebrate. So Nayarit, for example, they don't celebrate in the way we expect. Almost no celebration in this way. So if you go through Central American countries, you're going to see different experiences. What I have here on the PowerPoint, it's a picture from Guatemala, which also reminds me of my childhood, So in my childhood, the Day of the Dead is also or the first or the second is also the days to go play kites. Guatemala, which the picture is from, in Guatemala, they have these huge kites. And their kites is not only beautiful, but the kites have printed or painted stories of people from the society or people from their families. On the kites are indigenous designs, and also images of the saints. And the tradition of kites on the Day of the Dead is done mostly to tell us about this connection between heaven and earth, this thin line of faith that connects us heaven and earth. So you're gonna see that happening in some Central American countries. I would love, I hope we have time in the end of this video to have some questions. If you have other experiences from other countries that you wanna share, I would love to hear that. I'm trying to hurry up so we don't miss time here. So some other elements of the tradition of celebrating Day of the Dead is the mourning, honoring, and remembering, from personal context to social dimension. I have it's a 1 minute video I'm gonna play to talk about the mourning. You may have seen this video before, but I will play for you. Anyway. Is it playing? So as you can see, one of the teachings is that Halloween and Day of the Dead are different things. So Halloween has to do more about fear and evil spirits, while Day of the Dead has this dimension of love. So you're mourning, but the mourning leads you to healing, because the idea of the Day of the Dead is your beloved one has come back to visit you once more, and once more you are a united family again. So it teaches children and adults not to fear death, and to understand that life, we are already in eternal life, different dimensions. And all the symbolism that you see in the feast is to lead you to, it's a reminder of that love and that life. The second piece that I always like addressing in the workshops is it's a space and a time for honoring and remembering. So moving from personal context to social dimension. So for us, especially for us churches, aside of creating our own ofrendas in home, we're also invited to create ofrendas for, it's kind of tiny, isn't it? Ofrendas for situations in the society. When I was in California, we did several ofrendas remembering those who died crossing the border between Mexico and United States. Last year here in the parish, we did Black Lives Matter ofrenda to remember those who are suffering injustice and killed. So it's an opportunity for the church to tell their story and to share their sorrows. That's just another example that combines some of Asian and African American memories. It's an opportunity to bring also stories from the parish, people who have been involved in different ministries who are not with us anymore. I see 3:30. So I'm going to jump to the final comments. So if people have questions, we can address. Oh, I didn't talk yet about the elements of ofrendas. I will do that quickly.
I think that that's important. So
Sorry?
That's important. So definitely mention that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me change the pantalla. Elements of the altar.
While you're finding it, we've had some really good comments come in, including one from our friend and lifelong learning supporter, Gail Fisher Stewart, who says that our comment about Dias de Muertos was, it seems like death is less scary and answers questions from many mainline Christians, including, you know, when will I see my people again? And so that's a wonderful comment to that sort of explains what else is happening as part of it. And we are open for questions. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the comments, and then we'll ask them of Sam. So then that way he can be ready with all of your Days of the Dead questions.
So we do have, while you do that, this is the basic of the basic that I'm showing to you. What the ofrenda would look like. So they generally have an image of a saint from the Christian tradition, and it says they're Catholic saint, but can be any saint from the Christian tradition. The favorite dish and drink of the deceased. I have seen often Coke and Fanta, and also I have seen often tequila. But the idea is when the dead is coming back, we will also feast with you. Here it says the dog. Not many altars in the United States. You don't see much here in the United States. You see many more ofrendas in Mexico with the dog. It's generally a dark-skinned dog. The indigenous believed that that dog would lead the dead from the living back to the world of the dead. So Mexico has a very particular type of dog. If you have seen the movie Coco, that dog is the one that shows has no fur, no hair. So it's a very particular type of dog, which I can't remember the breed right now, but the dog is one of the elements that goes there. Papel picado are the flags. So we always say the 4 elements should be appear on the ofrendas: air, fire, water, and earth. So the papel picado represents the air, represents feast, joy, and the other representation for the element of air is the incense or copal. I always recommend churches who are doing the incense to see what your local context is. Here in St. Stephen's, because we have a group of Mexican families, we've been using the traditional copal censer. And generally, the elders of the community are the ones who come and censor the altars. So I prefer to have a lay person doing that instead me. If you have many ofrendas, then you need to have more than one person censing. When you talk about the element of earth, you have salt and you have the flowers. So flowers, because grow from the earth, salt it speaks by itself. It's the symbol of purification. The flower that generally we use is marigold, which in Mexico is said cempasúchil, meaning many little tiny flowers. And of all the symbols from the Day of the Dead, the marigolds is the oldest. So the indigenous believe that the smell from the marigold would create a pathway for the dead to find us. So generally when people prepare the ofrendas, they're gonna or create a cross made of petals of marigolds, or they would bring petals of marigolds to the entrance of the house, to the entrance of the church, in our case, here in the United States, leading to the ofrendas. So it was just like creating a pathway for the dead to find the way to meet the family. These ones here that are showing the basic of the basic. There are many other things that you can add. Again, you always should ask your community what is relevant for them. My first parish in the United States, I had one family who really had a hard time to have a sugar school and the ofrenda. So as a community, we decided not to use it. So see what's relevant for your community and what's respectful. I don't know if we can add, but there is another long list of things that can be used for the Day of the Dead. And if we want to create a link, maybe people can download later. So there is the explanation from the Mexican point of view. Mention the earth, wind, water, fire, salt, sometimes used for purification. And then there is this long list of things: photograph, marigolds, grass, papel picado, personal objects. So if you're doing in an area that's public, that there is the risk of somebody stealing something, better not to use, just make your altar in home. but if the place is a safe place, people can bring it. Water is always there. Plate with salt is always there. The bread of the dead, that's another tradition. You find that in Michoacan in Oaxaca. People break a specific type of bread for the dead and sits on the ofrenda until the last day. After the day is passed, then people can eat. Particularly, I love the bread of the dead. It's a very, very good flavor. Mole de gallina is chicken mole. So in Mexico, people make a very good distinction between simple food and classy food. So tacos, unless the person was crazy for tacos, you wouldn't put tacos in an ofrenda. You would go for the best of the best. So generally chicken mole is there because it's a classy dish to be on the altar. Needle and thread, candles. Why for us candles are so important? In my experience, we always put the Easter candle to remind us of the experience of resurrection of Christ. Then there is candy, calaca, and many other things that you can choose or not to use. So again, always ask your community what they would like to see or to have it. Now, yes, the final comments. They're going to be short and quick. Now I lost. Where did you guys go?
And we do have some questions, so whenever you're ready for them.
Okay.
I think we're...
So the only two comments I'm going to add here, since I don't want to take too long, is to talk about the Catrina, La Santa Muerte, and issues on what I'm calling here bicultural children and teenagers. So the Catrina, we have seen more often these days in the United States being used. We see how much stores like Target are selling stuff for Day of the Dead. So we always recommend people to make things from the scratch instead of buying stuff. You're gonna see a lot images of Catrina. Catrina is this character of what used to be a wealthy woman who died, and now she's just like any other skeleton. So mocking the Catrina and mocking the rich, that's the function of have a Catrina, especially on the parades for the Day of the Dead. It's quite new. The idea of the skeletons came back in Mexico when José Posadas, in the beginning of 20th century, he begins drawing. What we call when the drawing is to mock somebody or to make fun of somebody.
Caricature.
Caricature, yeah. So he did play with that idea of the caricature. And the Catrina came to be on that period of time. So was in the beginning of 20th century. I also want to say a few words about La Santa Muerte. This is a theme that divides us in many ways because there's so many different orientations about La Santa Muerte. So La Santa Muerte is not the same sister death that St. Francis talked about. La Santa Muerte is a more recent tradition that many times is related to drug dealers. Many times is presented as the protector of drug dealers, or you're gonna find chapels on the way where drug dealers work, roads and crossing passes. And more and more is becoming related to also witchcraft things like that. You're gonna find also people who talks differently about La Santa Muerte. So you really need to find your ground with what the theme of La Santa Muerte means to you personally. So I generally don't recommend using either Catrina or La Santa Muerte. But again, talk to your congregation, community, and families. And the other thing I always tell the parents is about the bicultural experience. So many Latinos who are first and probably second generation have the celebration of the Day of the Dead very present in their lives. And sometimes they want their kids just focus in the Day of the Dead. But children and teenagers who are born here, they don't have that experience or that cultural memory. So we, as church, have the responsibility to build that. And it is okay for a child or for a teen to celebrate Halloween in one day and the following day to celebrate the Day of the Dead, because they were born in here and they have the right to celebrate, make their own culture, live in culture. Questions?
You can ask Gail's question. So Gail asked, would it be cultural appropriation for a congregation that is multicultural to lift up dead, even those cultures? Sorry, I'm going to start again. For a congregation that is multicultural to lift up the dead of those cultures in the Dias de los Muertos, even though that is not their tradition? Or would it be better to join with a congregation where it is their tradition to do this?
Yes, I get that question a lot. Because we get the question because this is a very sensitive question. What I have learned is if you're following the pattern or the model that's done in Mexico mostly, it's always good to bring folks who can teach you about that from their own experiences. If you don't have any Latino in your community and you wanna embrace that, bring folks who can provide that information for you. So it's a sharing experience moment. I think it's a good idea also for congregations to come together and bring their intentions. It's almost like when you prepare the prayers of the people on Sunday, is you know, different people from different background are bringing their own intentions. So the idea of having congregations celebrating together is beautiful. And if Gail is open, we can always do it. And sometimes you don't have a Latino person in the community, but the community may have their own ways of doing that doesn't necessarily need to follow the Mexican pattern or model. So I always invite to talk to the community and see if they may have already something they have done in home or in their childhood that could be elements to use to celebrate, because All Saints and All Souls are a universal feast. So it could be celebrated in different ways.
That was the only question that we had online. Did you have any questions for Sam?
Just for people who are seeing us to know, what's your plan for celebration of the Days of the Dead in your church this year?
This year. So what I generally do, it's a month or a month and a half before November, I offer 1 or 2 workshops. The workshop will have a little bit of the history, a little bit of why we do it, and the other half of the workshop is basically how do we build all the things from scratch, and then break in small groups. It's really an excellent time to get to know people, because that's when in our case, we have the English-speaking congregation coming together with the Spanish-speaking congregation. Spanish-speaking folks, they are talking about something they know well. They have been doing this through their lives. So there is a sense of family again. There is no dynamics of power here. There is sharing from the point of view of love. And then after the workshops are done, we wait till the Sunday before the Day of the Dead. And then on the Sunday before the Day of the Dead, everybody who participates in those workshops come together and build the altars. So last year we had a couple who built the ones for the Black Lives Matter. This year they're gonna do it again. We're gonna have a group building ofrenda for those. So somebody donated a bicycle. We're gonna have an ofrenda just dedicated to those people who died bike accidents. So that Sunday before the Day of the Dead is when we prepare the altars, and the altars are gonna be there for 1 week for everybody who passed by the church or went to the church. And this year we are also making the decorations on the burial place outside of the church. So people who are passing outside on the street, we're gonna see that happen. It's an opportunity for us to remember our beloved ones, and it's an opportunity to also speak about injustice in this country. I know we're gonna have a group working in immigrants who died also crossing the border. And finally, on November 1st, which All Saints, we do a bilingual celebration. In the bilingual celebration, people are invited to come bring in food for the ofrendas and for the after celebration, Eucharistic celebration. So we have Eucharist. People, as they would go to the parade on the street, they come to church, which means they have their faces painted. Adults and children. It's a space for children and teenagers to have a new and better understanding of what death means, but also a space to talk about justice and injustice. After Eucharist, we open tables and we feast with the dead. So it has been a very beautiful experience, and it stays there until the following Sunday. And through that week, we create a space on the ofrenda where people can write notes with the names of their deceased, or sometimes I have seen people bringing photos. So it's like a living altar being built through the week. It creates space for parishioners, but also people who are just coming for to use this space. We rent the space of the church a lot. So I have many organizations coming and going.
Wonderful. Do you have any other questions? No. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of your wisdom with us. I think I might head down to St. Stephen's or San Esteban in order to participate and in order to honor all of my beloved ones. And thank you again for talking to sort of how really all congregations, not just Episcopal congregations, can really anticipate and understand what this cultural and religious tradition is all about. And so I look forward to learning more from you in the future.
Let me know if anybody want to get in touch and get to know more. I will be here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Sam, you hold tight.